Antonio Russo ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist, but every Christmas Eve he stood alone in his fortress, watching the world celebrate what he'd long abandoned. Then Stephanie Banks, his fearless new maid, shattered 15 years of isolation with few words that would unravel everything. Are you planning to spend Christmas Eve staring at that window until the champagne runs out? Before we dive in, drop your city in the comments, let's connect, and when we're done, rate this story from 0 to 10. Now, let's begin. The question cut through the penthouse like a knife through butter, sharp and unexpected. Stephanie Banks stood near the hallway entrance, her worn-out coat slung over one arm, car keys dangling from her fingers. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago. The other staff had scattered like ghosts the moment the clock struck 6, eager to escape the suffocating silence of the Russo estate. But Stephanie had lingered, watching the man who terrified half of New York stand motionless before floor-to-ceiling windows, his broad shoulders rigid beneath an impeccably tailored black suit. Antonio Russo didn't turn around. He simply lifted the crystal tumbler to his lips, the amber liquid catching the glow of the city lights 20 stories below. "That's the plan, Miss Banks," he said, his voice low and edged with ice. "Does my schedule concern you?" Stephanie tilted her head, her dark ponytail swaying as she studied him. "Not your schedule, no. But the fact that you've been standing in the exact same spot for 40 minutes? Yeah, that's a little concerning." She paused, then added with a grin, "You're starting to look like one of those sad sculptures in a modern art museum. Very expensive, very brooding, very alone." Antonio finally turned. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, locked onto hers. Most people flinched under that gaze. Stephanie just smiled wider, completely unbothered. He was dangerous. Everyone knew that. The tattoos snaking up his neck and disappearing beneath his collar weren't just for show. They were a map of his past. Each inked line a story of violence, loyalty, and survival. But Stephanie had learned something in her 3 weeks working here. Antonio Russo wasn't just dangerous. He was profoundly, devastatingly lonely. "Miss Banks," he said slowly, as if testing her resolve, "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I'm perfectly fine spending the evening alone." Stephanie let out a laugh, bright and unapologetic. "Oh, you're fine?" She gestured around the cavernous penthouse with its marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and absolute silence. "This place is so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls." "That's not fine, Signor Russo. That's a horror movie waiting to happen." Antonio's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this being challenged by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Stephanie took a step closer, her expression softening. "I'm heading to my Nona's place in Queens. It's loud, it's chaotic. There will be at least 15 people crammed into a house meant for 6, and the food is so good it should be illegal." She paused, watching him carefully. "We've got an extra chair at the table. If you want to come, you're welcome. No pressure, no expectations, just an invitation." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Antonio stared at her, trying to find the angle, the hidden motive, the catch. But there was nothing in Stephanie's eyes except genuine warmth and a hint of mischief. No one had invited him anywhere in years, not without wanting something in return. Money, influence, protection, fear. "You're inviting me," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "To your grandmother's house? For Christmas dinner?" "That's right." Stephanie shrugged, casual as anything. "Look, my Nona has this rule. No one spends Christmas alone. She says it's bad luck, bad for the soul, and honestly bad for digestion because sadness ruins the appetite." She shot him a playful smile. "So, technically I'm saving your life here." Antonio almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he took another sip of his drink, using the moment to regain control. "Miss Banks, while I appreciate the gesture, it's not exactly appropriate for me to be human for one night," Stephanie interrupted, her voice gentle now. "Come on, Signor Russo, you've spent every Christmas for the past decade alone in this penthouse. Don't you think it's time to try something different?" Her words hit harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Antonio looked back at the window, at the glittering city that felt like a cage. He thought about the silence, the endless bottles of expensive liquor, the carefully curated emptiness of his life. He thought about the way Stephanie hummed old pop songs while she worked, the way her laughter filled rooms that hadn't heard joy in years. "Dinner's at 8, Stephanie said, pulling on her coat. "The house is on Maplewood Avenue, the one with the crooked wreath and the inflatable snowman that's half deflated. Can't miss it." She headed for the door, then paused and glanced back. "And Signore Russo? If you do show up, don't bring anything fancy. Nona will just lecture you about wasting money." The elevator doors closed behind Stephanie with a soft chime, and suddenly the penthouse felt larger than it had any right to be. Antonio stood frozen in the exact spot where she'd left him, his untouched whiskey growing warmer by the second, the ice cubes reduced to slivers floating in amber liquid. He looked at his watch. 7:15. Dinner was at 8. "Ridiculous," he muttered, finally moving from his spot by the window. He walked to the bar, set down his glass with more force than necessary, and began pacing the length of the living room. His footsteps echoed off the marble floors, each step a reminder of just how empty this place really was. Antonio Russo didn't do family dinners. He didn't do warm holiday gatherings with people he barely knew. He certainly didn't show up uninvited, technically invited, but still to the home of an employee's grandmother in Queens, like some desperate charity case. He was a businessman, a very specific kind of businessman whose reputation was built on control, distance, and the kind of respect that came from fear. People didn't invite him to dinner. They invited him to negotiations, to backroom deals, to meetings where the stakes were high and the consequences higher. But they didn't invite him to Christmas. Antonio stopped pacing and stared at his reflection in the darkened windows. The man looking back at him was everything he'd built himself to be: powerful, untouchable, alone. When had alone stopped feeling like strength and started feeling like punishment? He thought about Stephanie's words. "You've spent every Christmas for the past decade alone in this penthouse. Don't you think it's time to try something different?" "It's inappropriate," he said aloud to the empty room. "She's an employee. This crosses every professional boundary." The silence offered no argument. "And it's dangerous," he continued, his voice harder now. "Anyone associated with me becomes a target. Her family doesn't need that risk." Still, the silence said nothing. Antonio checked his watch again. 7:30. He could stay here, pour another drink, watch the city lights until they blurred together, wake up tomorrow to the same empty rooms, the same suffocating quiet, the same carefully constructed isolation he'd convinced himself was necessary. Or he could do something completely insane. "This is insane," Antonio muttered, grabbing his black wool coat from the closet. He shrugged it on, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like armor. But as he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, he realized that for once, armor wasn't what he needed. The drive from Manhattan to Queens should have taken 30 minutes. Antonio stretched it to 45, taking turns too carefully, stopping at yellow lights instead of gunning through them, finding reasons to delay the inevitable. His car, a sleek black Maserati that probably cost more than 3 years of Stephanie's salary, felt absurdly out of place the moment he crossed into Queens. The streets narrowed, the buildings shortened, and the landscape transformed from towering glass and steel to rows of modest homes with chain-link fences and weathered siding. Snow had started falling an hour ago, dusting everything in a thin layer of white that made the neighborhood look almost magical. Christmas lights blinked from nearly every house, multicolored strands hung with more enthusiasm than precision, inflatable Santas listing to one side, wooden reindeer anchored to front lawns. Antonio's GPS announced his arrival with mechanical cheerfulness. He slowed to a crawl, scanning the street until he found it, the house with the crooked wreath and the half-deflated snowman Stephanie had mentioned. It was small. Not just smaller than his penthouse, objectively small. A 2-story house painted pale yellow with white trim, the kind of place that probably held a lifetime of memories in rooms the size of his walk-in closet. The wreath on the front door hung at a slight angle, held up by determination and possibly prayer. Through the curtained windows, he could see movement, shadows of people passing back and forth, the warm glow of lights that had nothing to do with expensive fixtures and everything to do with life actually being lived inside. Antonio put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. What was he doing here? He was Antonio Russo. He'd built an empire from nothing, survived wars that left better men dead, commanded respect from people who didn't even know his face. He didn't need this. He didn't need the pity invitation from a maid who thought she could fix his loneliness with her grandmother's cooking and mismatched decorations. He reached for the gear shift, ready to leave. Then the front door of the yellow house opened, and a small child, maybe 6 years old, ran out into the snow without a coat, shrieking with laughter as an older woman chased after her, waving a scarf. The woman caught the girl, wrapped the scarf around her neck with exaggerated care, and the child threw her arms around the woman's legs in a fierce hug before darting back inside. The simple affection of it, the uncomplicated love, hit Antonio like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had hugged him without wanting something? When was the last time he'd felt anything other than the weight of his own isolation? Antonio turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the car felt different than the silence in his penthouse. This silence was expectant, full of possibility rather than emptiness. "This is insane," he said one more time. But his hand was already reaching for the door handle. The cold air hit him as he stepped out, snowflakes immediately settling on his dark coat. He closed the car door with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet street. Every step toward that crooked wreath felt like walking toward something irreversible, some line he couldn't uncross once he'd stepped over it. Antonio stood at the door, his hand raised to knock, frozen in that moment between the life he knew and the life he might be stepping into. Through the door he could hear music, something classic and Italian, probably Dean Martin, and laughter. Real laughter, the kind that came from genuine joy rather than polite obligation. He could still leave, get back in his car, return to his penthouse, pretend this moment never happened. Instead, Antonio Russo knocked on the door. Footsteps approached, quick and light. The door swung open, and there was Stephanie. Flour dusted across her cheek like war paint, her dark hair escaping from a messy ponytail, wearing a floral apron over jeans and a cream-colored sweater. Behind her, the house glowed with warmth and noise, and the scent of garlic and roasting meat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Stephanie's eyes widened, genuine surprise flickering across her face before transforming into the brightest smile Antonio had ever seen. "You came," she said, and there was no triumph in her voice. "No, I told you so. Just pure, uncomplicated happiness." Antonio, the man who'd negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, who'd stared down armed enemies without flinching, found himself completely disarmed by a flour-dusted smile and untamed hair. "I'm probably going to regret this," he said. Stephanie's smile somehow got bigger. "Probably," she agreed, stepping back and holding the door open wider. "But at least you'll regret it with a full stomach. Come on, Signor Russo, welcome to chaos." And Antonio Russo, who'd spent a decade building walls to keep the world out, stepped through the doorway and let himself be welcomed in. The moment Antonio stepped through the doorway, the music died. Not a gradual fade, but an abrupt stop, as if someone had yanked the needle off a record. The sudden silence felt louder than any sound Antonio had ever heard. He stood in the small entryway, snowflakes still melting on his shoulders, and watched as every person in the cramped living room turned to stare at him. There were at least a dozen people packed into a space that was probably meant for half that number. An older man frozen mid-gesture with a glass of wine, 2 teenage girls sitting cross-legged on the floor, their phones forgotten. A middle-aged woman holding a serving platter, her mouth slightly open. A young boy clutching a toy car, his eyes wide. They all stared at the imposing stranger in the $1,000 coat and tailored black suit, his presence filling the doorway like a storm cloud in their warm, colorful chaos. Antonio felt the familiar weight of their attention, the assessment, the fear. He'd walked into rooms full of dangerous men who looked at him with less apprehension than this family showed now. He started to second-guess everything, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket in a gesture that was more habit than intention. Then a voice cut through the silence like a bell. "Benvenuto!" A tiny woman couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall and built like a firecracker emerged from what Antonio assumed was the kitchen. She wore an apron covered in tomato sauce stains and wielded a wooden spoon like a scepter. Her hair was pure silver, pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief or wisdom, or both. This, Antonio realized, was Nona. She marched right up to him, completely unbothered by the fact that he towered over her by at least a foot, and looked him up and down with the critical eye of someone who'd seen everything life had to offer and wasn't impressed by expensive tailoring. "So," she said, her accent thick with the old country, "you're the one who keeps my Stephanie working late." Before Antonio could formulate a response, she waved her wooden spoon dismissively. "No matter. You're here now. We saved you a plate, figlio mio. Come, come, you're too skinny. Stephanie said you don't eat enough." "Nona, I never said," Stephanie started, but her grandmother was already ushering Antonio further into the house. "Take off that fancy coat before you overheat. Carlo!" she shouted toward the man with the wine glass. "Get our guests something to drink. And somebody start the music again. What is this, a funeral? It's Christmas." Just like that, the spell broke. The music resumed, Dean Martin crooning about letting it snow, and the family returned to their conversations, though Antonio could feel their curious glances. Carlo approached with a glass of red wine, his handshake firm and his smile cautious but genuine. "Carlo Moretti," he introduced himself, "Stephanie's uncle. Welcome to our home." "Antonio Russo," he replied, taking the wine. "Thank you for having me." "Well, when Nona decides you're coming to dinner, you're coming to dinner," Carlo laughed. "Arguing with her is like arguing with the tide. You'll lose, and you'll get wet." Stephanie appeared at Antonio's side, gently taking his coat. "Survived the entrance exam," she murmured, her eyes dancing with amusement. "The hard part's over." "Is it?" Antonio asked quietly. "Absolutely not," she said with a grin. "But lying to you seemed mean. Dinner was chaos in its purest form." Antonio found himself seated at a table that had clearly been extended with additional leaves and, probably some prayer, wedged between Carlo and a woman introduced as Aunt Teresa. Across from him sat Stephanie, flanked by the 2 teenage girls, her cousins, Gina and Maria, who kept sneaking glances at him like he was an exotic animal that might do something interesting. The table itself was a marvel of organized disaster. Platters of food covered every available inch, roasted chicken glistening with herbs, pasta in a sauce so red it looked like liquid rubies, vegetables that had been roasted with enough garlic to ward off vampires for miles, fresh bread that steamed when broken open, and something Nona called the antipasto that could have fed a small village. "So, Antonio," Carlo said, loading his plate with alarming efficiency, "what do you do for work?" It was such a simple question, the kind normal people asked at normal dinners, but Antonio, who'd spent years crafting careful responses about import-export business and private investments, found himself hesitating. Stephanie caught his eye from across the table. She took a sip of wine, completely relaxed, and gave him the subtlest nod. "Your call," her expression said. "But you're safe here." "I'm in private security and asset management," Antonio said carefully. It wasn't a lie, just an extremely generous interpretation of the truth. "Ah," Aunt Teresa brightened. "Like a bodyguard?" "Something like that," Antonio agreed. "He has an entire building in Manhattan," Stephanie added helpfully, fighting a smile. "Very impressive. Lots of windows." "Windows!" Nona scoffed from the head of the table, pointing her fork at Antonio. "What good are windows? Can you eat windows? Do windows keep you warm at night?" "No. Food keeps you warm. Family keeps you warm. Here, eat more chicken. You look like a strong wind could snap you." Antonio looked down at his plate, which was already piled higher than he'd normally eat in 2 meals. I assure you, Signora, I'm quite… Nona, she corrected firmly. You call me Nona, and don't argue with me about food. I've been cooking for 60 years. I know when a man needs more chicken. She stood up, came around the table despite Stephanie's protests, and deposited another piece of chicken onto Antonio's plate with the authority of a general deploying troops. Carlo leaned over and whispered conspiratorially, "Just eat it. Trust me. Resistance is futile." Antonio looked at the chicken, then at Nona's expectant face, then at Stephanie, who was clearly trying not to laugh. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Antonio Russo did something completely unexpected. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a calculated display of humor, but a real laugh, the kind that started in his chest and surprised him with its genuineness. The table quieted for just a moment, and Stephanie's smile softened into something that made Antonio's breath catch. "Thank you, Nona," he said, and meant it. "Finally!" Nona declared triumphantly, returning to her seat. He smiles. "See, Stephanie? I told you he just needed good food. Men are simple creatures. Feed them, love them, they're happy." The meal continued in a blur of conversation and laughter. Gina and Maria grilled Antonio about whether he'd ever met any celebrities. Uncle Carlo told increasingly elaborate stories about his years as a cab driver that may or may not have been entirely true. Aunt Teresa debated the proper way to make marinara sauce with Nona in a discussion that got passionate enough that Stephanie had to remind them it was Christmas. Through it all, Antonio felt increasingly untethered from reality. This wasn't his world. These people didn't speak in coded language or carefully measured words. They interrupted each other, talked with their hands, laughed too loudly, and expressed every emotion without filter or calculation. And somehow, impossibly, he was part of it. Every time the noise got too loud or the questions too personal, he'd catch Stephanie's eye across the table. She'd make a face rolling her eyes at one of Carlo's more outrageous stories, or silently miming Nona's dramatic hand gestures, and suddenly, the overwhelming chaos felt manageable. She was his anchor in the storm, but instead of weighing him down, she helped him float. "You're doing great," she mouthed at one point, when Nona launched into a passionate explanation of why store-bought pasta was a crime against nature. "I'm completely out of my depth," he mouthed back. "I know," she grinned. "It's adorable." Adorable. Antonio Russo had been called many things in his life: dangerous, ruthless, intimidating, powerful, never adorable. And yet, watching Stephanie's eyes sparkle with genuine affection rather than fear, he found he didn't mind. As dessert appeared some kind of elaborate cake that Nona insisted she'd thrown together, nothing special, Antonio realized something profound. For the first time in years, possibly decades, he wasn't in control. He hadn't orchestrated this evening, couldn't predict what would happen next, had no contingency plans or exit strategies. And it wasn't terrifying. It was liberating. "More wine?" Carlo asked, already reaching for the bottle. "Yes," Antonio said, surprising himself. "Thank you." Stephanie caught his eye again from across the table. This time, she didn't make a joke or a face. She just smiled at him, warm and genuine and completely unguarded. And in that moment, surrounded by the noise and chaos and overwhelming warmth of her family, Antonio understood something he'd forgotten he was missing. This was what home felt like. Not the expensive penthouse with its carefully curated silence and marble floors. Not the power or the control or the isolation he'd convinced himself was strength. Home was this, messy and loud and imperfect. It was Nona's forceful generosity and Carlo's terrible stories and Stephanie's anchoring presence. It was being surrounded by people who expected nothing from you except your presence, who measured your worth not in what you could do for them but in whether you'd take seconds of the chicken. "Antonio." Stephanie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You okay?" He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the playful maid who'd challenged him in his own penthouse, but the source of all this warmth. She'd invited him not because she wanted something from him, but because she'd seen his loneliness and couldn't stand it. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. I'm okay. And for the first time in a very long time, it was true. The drive back to Manhattan felt like traveling between two different worlds. Antonio sat behind the wheel of his Maserati, the engine's purr, a stark contrast to the raucous laughter still echoing in his memory. The streets of Queens gave way to highways, then bridges, then the familiar glass and steel canyons of his carefully controlled reality. But something fundamental had shifted, like a gear that wouldn't quite slip back into its original position. The silence in the car wasn't the same silence he'd lived with for years. It wasn't empty or suffocating. It was reflective, full of the ghosts of the evening he'd just experienced. He could still smell Nona's cookies. She'd pressed a container into his hands as he left, refusing to hear his protests. The scent filled the car, warm and sweet, completely at odds with the leather and expensive cologne that usually dominated this space. Antonio's mind kept replaying moments from the dinner. Nona's fierce generosity, Carlo's terrible jokes that somehow made him laugh anyway. The way Stephanie had anchored him through the chaos, her eyes finding his whenever the noise became too much, her smile a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. That was the dangerous part, he realized as the city lights blurred past. He'd known Stephanie for 3 weeks. She cleaned his floors, hummed off-key pop songs, and left sticky notes with smiley faces on his expensive coffee machine. She should have been completely unremarkable in the landscape of his life. Instead, she'd become essential. The penthouse felt even emptier than usual when he returned. The marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, the minimalist furniture sat in perfect arrangement, and the silence pressed against his ears like cotton wool. Antonio set Nona's cookies on the kitchen counter, the only splash of warmth in the sterile space, and stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of his isolation like never before. He'd spent years building this fortress. Now it felt like a prison. Antonio poured himself a drink he didn't want, stood by the windows overlooking the city, and made a decision that terrified him almost as much as it excited him. He needed to find a way to keep that warmth in his life. He needed Stephanie closer, where the walls he'd built couldn't shut her out completely. And he needed to do it in a way that didn't completely expose how desperately he needed her presence. The next morning, Antonio arrived at his office before dawn, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way his assistant, Marco DeLucci, found him staring out the window instead of reviewing security reports or fielding calls from people who operated best in darkness. "Boss?" Marco's voice carried a note of concern. He was Antonio's second in command, a man who'd been with him for 15 years and could read his moods better than anyone. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Antonio said, turning from the window. "I need you to pull Stephanie Banks's file and tell her I want to see her in my office at 9. Marco's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise before professional neutrality slammed back into place. "The new cleaning girl? That's the one. May I ask why?" Antonio met his gaze steadily. "No." Marco nodded once, accepting the dismissal, but Antonio could see the questions churning behind his eyes. In their world, sudden changes in routine meant danger. Unexpected attention on junior staff meant either a problem or a weakness. Marco would be watching carefully, and Antonio couldn't entirely blame him. But he also couldn't explain that somewhere between Nona's chicken and Stephanie's anchoring smile, something in him had fundamentally cracked open, and he wasn't sure he wanted to seal it back up. Stephanie arrived at 9 sharp, looking slightly confused and carrying a bottle of window cleaner. She'd clearly been pulled from her morning rounds. Her hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same uniform as always, black pants and a simple white shirt that somehow looked better on her than it had any right to. "You wanted to see me, Signore Russo?" she asked, standing in the doorway of his office with the cautious posture of someone expecting trouble. Antonio gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Miss Banks, and you can leave the cleaning supplies by the door." Stephanie set down the window cleaner, then settled into the leather chair with the wariness of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "If this is about last night, I'm sorry if my family was too—" "Your family was perfect," Antonio interrupted, surprising them both. He cleared his throat, recalibrating. Last night made me realize something. I need someone on my staff who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. Someone who sees things my other employees miss because they're too busy being intimidated. Stephanie tilted her head, studying him. Okay. I'm offering you a new position, Antonio said, pulling a folder from his desk drawer. He'd spent the early morning hours drafting the proposal himself, not trusting even Marco with the details. Personal assistant and risk analyst. You'd work directly with me, reviewing security protocols, attending meetings, providing assessment of situations from a perspective my current team lacks. You want me to be your assistant, Stephanie said slowly. Me. The girl who 2 weeks ago accidentally used furniture polish on your windows. The pay is triple your current salary, Antonio continued, ignoring her point. You'd have your own office, full benefits, and access to the executive floors. No more cleaning. Your only job would be to be present, observant, and honest. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, and Antonio felt something uncomfortably close to nervousness. He'd negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with less anxiety than he felt waiting for this 24-year-old woman to respond. Why? She finally asked. I told you. No, she interrupted gently. Why really? Because this isn't about security protocols or risk analysis. You have an entire team of expensive experts for that. So, why do you really want me working directly for you? Antonio met her eyes, those clear, perceptive eyes that had seen through him from the first day. He could lie. He was excellent at lying. But something about Stephanie made deception feel impossible. Because you're the only person in 10 years who's treated me like a human being instead of a title, he said quietly. Because you invited me to your grandmother's house and expected nothing in return. Because when I'm around you, the silence doesn't feel quite so suffocating. The honesty hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Stephanie's expression softened, but she didn't look away. Okay, she said finally. I'll accept, on one condition. Antonio raised an eyebrow. You're negotiating with me? You said you wanted honesty, she pointed out. So here's some honesty. You're kind of a jerk to your other staff. Not in big ways, but in 1,000 small ways. The way you don't say good morning, or how you bark orders without please or thank you, or how you act like the people who keep this building running are invisible. Antonio felt his jaw tighten. I'm professional. I maintain appropriate boundaries. You use fear as a management tool when you could use respect, Stephanie interrupted. You don't need people to be afraid of you, Signore Russo. You need better manners. The fear thing is actually distracting from how genuinely intimidating you are naturally. Despite himself, Antonio almost smiled. Is that your professional assessment? That's my honest assessment, she replied. So my condition is this. I'll take the job, but you have to actually try being nice to people. Real nice, not that scary thing you do where you smile without your eyes, say good morning. Learn people's names. Acknowledge that they exist as human beings. And if I don't? Stephanie grinned. Then I'll go back to accidentally polishing your windows with furniture spray, and you can find another truth teller. Good luck with that, by the way. Most people are way too scared of you to tell you when you have spinach in your teeth. Antonio stared at her for a long moment. She stared back, completely unintimidated, waiting. In that moment, he recognized exactly why he needed her close. Stephanie Banks was either the bravest or most foolish person he'd ever met, and he couldn't quite decide which. Maybe she was both. Fine, he said. I'll work on my manners. Excellent. Stephanie stood, extending her hand across the desk. Then you have a deal, Signora Russo. Antonio took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. Antonio, he said, if you're going to be my personal assistant, you should call me Antonio. Nope, she said cheerfully, releasing his handshake. I like Signora Russo. It makes me feel fancy, like I'm in an Italian movie. Plus, if I call you Antonio, I might forget you're supposed to be terrifying. She headed for the door, then paused and looked back. When do I start? Tomorrow, Antonio said. 9 a.m. And, Miss Banks? Thank you. For last night. Stephanie's smile was warm and genuine. Thank you for coming. Nona wants to know if you're free for Sunday dinner next week. Apparently, you need fattening up. Before Antonio could respond, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of window cleaner and the lingering warmth of her presence. Antonio sat back in his chair, a real smile tugging at his lips. Then his door opened again, and Marco stepped in. His expression carefully neutral in a way that meant he was definitely not feeling neutral. "Boss," Marco said slowly. "Did you just promote the cleaning girl to personal assistant?" "I did. Can I ask what qualifications she has for this position?" "She's not afraid of me," Antonio said simply. Marco's expression flickered with something that looked like concern. "Boss, with all due respect, there are reasons people in our organization are afraid of you. Valid reasons. Promoting someone who doesn't understand the dangers of this world, are you questioning my judgment?" "Marco?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Marco straightened, reading the warning clearly. "No, sir. Just expressing concern for security protocols." "Your concern is noted," Antonio said, his voice returning to its usual ice. "Miss Banks starts tomorrow. Make sure her office is ready and that security clearance is processed. And Marco? She's under my direct protection. Make sure everyone understands what that means." Marco nodded once, sharp and professional, but Antonio could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. His second-in-command was suspicious, protective of the organization they'd built, and deeply concerned about what he clearly saw as a dangerous distraction. He wasn't entirely wrong to be concerned. Stephanie was a liability, a weakness Antonio couldn't afford. But as he turned back to his window, watching the city wake up below, Antonio realized he was past the point of caring. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the cold calculation that had kept him alive and alone. He felt hope. And that was worth the risk. 3 weeks into her new role, Stephanie Banks had become both Antonio's greatest asset and his most persistent headache. She'd taken to the position with the same fearless energy she brought to everything else, attending meetings with men who could buy small countries, reviewing security footage with the sharp eye of someone who'd spent years noticing things other people missed, and somehow managing to make Antonio laugh at least once a day, something his staff had previously thought physically impossible. This morning, she'd left a coffee mug on his desk with a cartoon Mafia Don on it and the words, "I'm not saying I'm Batman, but have you ever seen me and Batman in the same room?" Antonio had stared at it for a full minute before Marco walked in and found him actually smiling. "She's corrupting you, boss," Marco had muttered, though there might have been the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. "She's keeping me sane," Antonio had corrected, taking a sip from the ridiculous mug. Now, at 2 in the afternoon, Stephanie sat across from him in his office while he reviewed a contract that could shift the balance of power in 3 states. She was supposed to be analyzing the security implications. Instead, she was scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up at him with barely contained amusement. "You're doing the thing again," she said without looking up. "What thing?" Antonio asked, not lifting his eyes from the contract. "The jaw-clenching thing. You're going to crack a molar if you keep that up." Antonio forced himself to relax his jaw. "This contract is worth $40 million. A certain amount of tension is appropriate." "A certain amount, sure," Stephanie agreed, finally setting down her phone. "But you've been staring at paragraph 7 for 10 minutes. Either it's written in ancient Greek, or you're overthinking it." She stood and walked around his desk, a liberty no one else would dare take, and peered at the document. "Ah, the liability clause. Yeah, that's deliberately vague. They're trying to trap you into assuming responsibility for their shipping errors." Antonio looked up at her, surprised. "How did you—" "My Uncle Carlo got screwed by a clause exactly like this when he was driving for a delivery company," she explained, leaning against his desk. "Cost him 6 months of wages. I learned to read the sneaky bits." She tapped the paragraph with her finger. "Counter with specific itemization of responsibilities. Make them spell out exactly what they're liable for. They'll either clarify or back down." Antonio stared at her for a moment, then made a note in the margin. That's actually brilliant. I know, she said cheerfully, returning to her chair. I'm starting to think you hired me for my brains and not just my devastating wit. I hired you because you're the only person who doesn't treat me like I'm going to murder them at any moment, Antonio said, then paused. The devastating wit was a bonus. Stephanie grinned, and Antonio felt that now familiar warmth spread through his chest. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd somehow made his sterile office feel less like a fortress and more like a space where he could actually breathe. There were touches of her everywhere now, a small plant on the windowsill that she claimed needed saving, colorful sticky notes with reminders and occasionally jokes, and the lingering scent of her coconut shampoo that had permanently replaced the smell of expensive leather and old wood. Marco had warned him repeatedly that he was getting too comfortable, too distracted, too soft. Antonio knew he was right. He also knew he didn't care. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Russo," his receptionist's voice came through, tight with nerves. "There's a package for you. Hand-delivered. No return address." Antonio's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Stephanie watched his expression transform from relaxed to razor-sharp, his body language changing from open to coiled. This, she realized, was the man everyone else saw, the one who made hardened criminals nervous. "Scan it," Antonio ordered. "Full security protocol." "Already done, sir. It's clean. Just an envelope. Bring it in. And get Marco." Stephanie sat up straighter. "What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Antonio said, but his tone suggested otherwise. The receptionist entered with a thin manila envelope, her hands slightly trembling as she placed it on Antonio's desk. Marco appeared seconds later, his expression alert and dangerous. He nodded once to Antonio, positioned himself near the door, blocking the exit, Stephanie realized, and waited. Antonio opened the envelope with calculated precision. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. When he unfolded it, Stephanie saw his face go completely blank, the kind of blank that meant he was feeling everything and showing nothing. On the paper was a symbol, a crown with 3 swords piercing through it, drawn in red ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Everybody out," Antonio said quietly. "Except Marco and Stephanie." The receptionist fled. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden tension. "The Corsini family," Marco said, his voice hard. "I thought we had an understanding with them." "So did I," Antonio replied, his fingers tracing the symbol without touching it. "This is their calling card. It means they consider a debt unpaid." "What debt?" Stephanie asked, then realized from the look both men gave her that she maybe shouldn't have. "Sorry. Not my business." "It is now," Antonio said grimly. "If they're sending this here to my office, they're making a statement. They know where I am, what I'm doing, and—" He looked at her, something dark flickering in his eyes. "Who I'm with." The implication hit Stephanie like cold water. "They're threatening me?" "They're threatening anyone I care about," Antonio corrected, then seemed to realize what he'd said. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unintended. Marco cleared his throat. "I'll increase security across all properties. Double the detail on your personal residence and—" He glanced at Stephanie. "Miss Banks' apartment as well." "No," Stephanie said firmly. "I'm not having armed guards following me to the grocery store. That's insane." "It's necessary," Antonio countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's overkill," Stephanie shot back. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I've lived in Queens my entire life. I can handle myself." "You can't handle the Corsini family," Marco said bluntly. "They're not street criminals, Miss Banks. They're organized, brutal, and if they've decided you're a target, then maybe we should figure out who delivered this," Stephanie interrupted, picking up the envelope. "Instead of arguing about bodyguards." Both men looked at her. She examined the envelope, turning it over in her hands. "Your receptionist said it was hand-delivered, right? Did she see who dropped it off?" "The building security has footage," Marco said. "But these people use couriers who don't know what they're delivering. Dead ends." "Maybe," Stephanie said slowly, still studying the envelope. But couriers are people. People have patterns. She looked up at Antonio. When I was cleaning offices, you know what I noticed? The same delivery people came at the same times, wore the same company's uniforms, had the same routes. It's muscle memory. Even if they're trying to be anonymous, they have tells. She walked to Antonio's desk and pulled up the security feed on his computer, with a familiarity that would have shocked her 3 weeks ago. What time did this arrive? 11:47, Marco provided. Stephanie scrolled through the footage until she found the timestamp. A man in a generic courier uniform appeared on screen, walking through the lobby with his head down, a baseball cap obscuring most of his face. He handed the envelope to the receptionist and left without a word. There, Stephanie said, pausing the footage. Look at his shoes. Antonio leaned in. What about them? They're Jordans. Limited edition. Probably cost $300. She looked at him. What kind of courier wears $300 sneakers to deliver packages? Either he's terrible with money, or he's not actually a courier. Marco moved closer to the screen, his expression shifting to something like respect. She's right. And look at the way he walks. That's not someone who's been on their feet all day making deliveries. That's someone who goes to the gym. Stephanie rewound the footage, watching the man's approach again. He touches his left hip twice before entering, like he's checking something. She paused. Like he's checking a weapon? The room went silent. Antonio stared at the screen, then at Stephanie, his expression caught between admiration and horror. You saw all that from watching him for 30 seconds? I told you. People have patterns, Stephanie said with a shrug. You just have to know what to look for. When you spend years being invisible while cleaning, you learn to observe. Marco was already on his phone, barking orders to run facial recognition and track the man's exit route. Antonio continued to stare at Stephanie like he was seeing her for the first time. You're brilliant, he said quietly. I know, she replied, but her smile was softer now. So are we going to figure out who this guy is, or are we just going to panic? Both, Antonio said. Marco, I want that man identified within the hour. Full background, known associates, current location, and I want to know who paid him. On it, boss. After Marco left, Antonio turned to Stephanie. His expression was serious in a way that made her nervous. You understand what this means, don't you? You broke their anonymous courier system. You just made yourself invaluable to me and extremely dangerous to them. So I've upgraded from liability to asset? Stephanie tried to joke. You've upgraded to target, Antonio said harshly. Then, more gently, Stephanie, I need you to understand how serious this is. These people don't make idle threats. I get it, she said. I do, but I'm not going to live in fear because I was good at my job. Antonio stood, walked around his desk, and stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the tension radiating from him. I'm installing a panic room in your apartment. Top-level security system, direct line to my personal phone, non-negotiable. That's completely... I said non-negotiable, Stephanie. His voice was soft but absolute. You've become... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. You've become important to me. I won't risk your safety because you're too stubborn to accept protection. Stephanie stared up at him, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. Important? Yes, Antonio said simply. Important. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unsaid. Stephanie knew she should step back, maintain professional distance, remember that this was her boss and a man whose world operated by rules she barely understood. But she didn't move. Okay, she said finally. Panic room. Security system. But I draw the line at a full-time bodyguard. I mean it, Antonio. He blinked, and she realized it was the first time she'd called him by his first name. Something shifted in his expression, softening the harsh edges. Deal. And you have to promise me something, Stephanie added. What? Promise me you'll be careful too, because if they're threatening people you care about, that goes both ways. You're not invincible, no matter how much you pretend to be. Antonio's hand came up, almost involuntarily, and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, so at odds with the dangerous man everyone else saw, that Stephanie's breath caught. "I promise," he said quietly. "But only if you stop leaving sticky notes in my contract briefings. Marco found one yesterday that said, 'This clause is sus.' He thought it was code." Despite everything, the threat, the danger, the weight of the moment, Stephanie laughed. And Antonio, the man who'd spent a decade building walls around himself, smiled at the sound. The panic room installation took 3 days. During those 3 days, Antonio found increasingly transparent reasons to keep Stephanie working late. It started professionally enough, reviewing security protocols, analyzing potential threats, discussing contingency plans. But as the winter nights grew longer and the office emptied of everyone except them, the conversations shifted. They talked about everything except work: Stephanie's childhood in Queens, Antonio's memories of his mother before she died, the strange isolation of power, the comfort of chaos. On the 4th night, they weren't even pretending to work anymore. Antonio sat on the leather couch in his office, his tie loosened and jacket discarded, while Stephanie occupied the chair she'd pulled up beside him. A bottle of wine sat half-empty on the coffee table between them, not the expensive vintage from his collection, but a cheap Chianti Stephanie had brought from a corner store, insisting it would humanize him. "So, let me get this straight," Stephanie said, her eyes bright with wine and laughter. "You've never been to Coney Island? You've lived in New York for 30 years and never once rode the cyclone?" "I've been busy," Antonio defended, though his lips twitched with amusement. "Busy being broody and powerful," she teased. "That doesn't count as living, Antonio. That's just existing with really good suits." "These suits are custom Italian," he protested mildly. "I know. I've seen the price tags." She took a sip of wine. "You could buy a car for what you spend on one jacket. It's obscene," says the woman who wore the same sneakers for 2 years because they were still good. Stephanie gasped in mock offense. "You noticed my shoes?" "I notice everything about you," Antonio said, and the sudden sincerity in his voice shifted the air between them. Stephanie set down her wine glass slowly. The playfulness dimmed into something deeper, something that had been building between them for weeks. "Antonio, I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. You work for me. My world is dangerous. There are 1,000 reasons this shouldn't." He stopped, running a hand through his hair in uncharacteristic frustration. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop needing you near me, and I don't know what to do with that." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Stephanie looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and dangerous reputation to the lonely man who'd shown up at her Nona's house because he couldn't bear another silent Christmas. "You could kiss me," she said softly. "That might help clarify things." Antonio's eyes widened slightly. "Stephanie, if I kiss you, everything changes. You understand that? There's no going back from that." "Good," she said, leaning closer. "I don't want to go back." For a moment, Antonio didn't move. Then, with the careful deliberation of someone making a choice he knew was irrevocable, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, his touch gentle in a way that contradicted everything dangerous about him. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "Antonio," Stephanie said, her lips curving into a smile even as her heart raced. "Stop overthinking and just—" He kissed her. It was nothing like Stephanie expected. She'd imagined Antonio would be controlled, calculated, holding back. Instead, the kiss was desperate and honest, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years and finally remembered how to breathe. His hands moved to her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and Stephanie's world narrowed to just this: his mouth on hers, the wine-warm taste of him, the way he held her like she was both precious and essential. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Antonio pressed his forehead to hers. "This is insane," he whispered. "I know," Stephanie replied, her fingers curling into his shirt. But you keep saying that about all the best decisions you make. He laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her closer. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Antonio Russo felt something other than the cold calculation that had kept him alive. He felt hope. He felt joy. He felt terrifyingly, vulnerably human. "Stay with me tonight," he said, then quickly added, "Just stay. I have guest rooms. I just don't want you to leave yet." Stephanie smiled against his shoulder. "Okay. But I'm calling Nona to let her know I won't be home, otherwise she'll send the National Guard." "Your grandmother terrifies me more than most criminals I know," Antonio admitted. "Good. That means you have excellent survival instincts." 2 weeks later, Antonio insisted on driving Stephanie home after another late night. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm professional during the day, something deeper and more personal after hours. They hadn't defined what they were to each other, but the boundaries had irreversibly blurred. "You don't have to drive me every time," Stephanie protested as they approached her neighborhood in Queens. "I'm perfectly capable of taking the train." "Humor me," Antonio said, his hand finding hers across the center console. "I like knowing you got home safely." "Overprotective," Stephanie accused. But she didn't pull her hand away. "Invested," Antonio corrected. He pulled up to the familiar yellow house, the one with the crooked wreath that had become a symbol of everything warm in his life. The porch light was on, and he could see the glow of the television through the curtains. Normal. Safe. Everything his world usually wasn't. "Thank you for the ride," Stephanie said, leaning over to kiss him quickly. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Antonio agreed, though he didn't release her hand immediately. Something felt off, a prickle of awareness he'd learned never to ignore. Stephanie noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, forcing himself to relax. "Go inside. I'll wait until you're in." She rolled her eyes but complied, grabbing her bag and heading up the walkway. Antonio watched her unlock the door and wave before disappearing inside. He should leave now. He should drive back to Manhattan and stop being paranoid about shadows. Instead, he put the car in park and waited. His security instincts, honed over decades, were screaming that something was wrong. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The street remained quiet. Just a normal winter evening in Queens. Antonio was about to write it off as paranoia when a black SUV turned onto the street, moving too slowly, too deliberately. Every muscle in Antonio's body tensed. The SUV stopped 3 houses down. 4 men got out, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Antonio recognized the walk, the way they scanned the street, the careful casualness that marked them as professionals. His hand moved to his phone, already dialing Marco, as he watched the men approach Stephanie's house. One of them pulled out a can of spray paint. Another smashed the porch light with a practiced swing of a baseball bat. Antonio was out of his car before conscious thought caught up with action. "Hey!" His voice cracked through the quiet street like thunder. The men turned. One of them, the leader, smiled a cold, calculating smile that confirmed everything Antonio needed to know. "Mr. Russo, we were hoping you'd still be around. Saves us the trouble of leaving a message." "You made a mistake coming here," Antonio said, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. This was the man Marco had warned Stephanie about, the man his enemies feared, the monster he'd spent weeks hiding from her. "Did we?" The leader gestured to the house. "Cute place. Heard your girlfriend's grandmother lives here. Be a shame if something happened to it. Or to her." That was the last sentence the man finished. Antonio moved with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent his entire life learning how to hurt people. The leader went down first, Antonio's fist connecting with his jaw before he could even raise his hands. The second man pulled a weapon, but Antonio was already there, disarming him with a savage twist that left the man screaming and clutching his broken wrist. The other 2 tried to rush him simultaneously. Antonio caught one with an elbow to the temple, sent him sprawling into the neighbor's fence. The last one got a single punch in Antonio, felt his lip split before he returned the favor tenfold, systematically breaking the man's nose, then his ribs, then his will to remain standing. It was over in less than 90 seconds. Antonio stood in the middle of the street, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles and his split lip, surrounded by 4 men who'd made the fatal error of threatening something he cared about. The controlled violence of it, the ease with which he'd dismantled them, was terrifying in its precision. "Who sent you?" Antonio demanded, kneeling beside the leader. The man spat blood. "Corsini said to send you a message." "Tell Corsini I received his message," Antonio said softly, dangerously. "And I'm sending one back. Anyone who touches what's mine answers to me personally, and I don't leave loose ends." The porch light, the one that hadn't been smashed, suddenly flooded the scene. Antonio looked up to see Stephanie standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She'd seen everything. Behind her, Nona appeared, took one look at the scene, and immediately began ushering neighbors back inside their homes with the authority of a woman who'd seen worse. But Stephanie didn't move. She just stared at Antonio, at the blood, at the broken men on her lawn, at the monster she'd invited into her life. Antonio felt something crack in his chest. This was what he'd been afraid of, not that she'd be in danger, but that she'd finally see him for what he really was. Not the man who laughed at her jokes or kissed her like she was air itself, but the brutal, violent reality of his world. "Stephanie," he started, his voice rough. She ran down the steps, not away from him, but toward him. Her hands found his face, her fingers gentle despite the blood. "Are you hurt? Antonio, are you okay?" "Am I?" He stared at her, confused. "Stephanie, did you not just see what I did?" "I saw you protect my family," she said fiercely. "I saw 4 men attack our home and you stopped them. Are you hurt? Hurt?" Our home didn't escape his notice, but Antonio was still reeling from her reaction. "My lip. It's nothing. Come inside," Stephanie ordered. "Nona, call the police." "No, actually, don't call the police." She looked at the groaning men on the lawn. "What do we do with them?" "Marco's already here," Antonio said as a familiar car pulled up, followed by 2 others. His security team emerged, efficiently collecting the attackers with the practiced ease of men used to cleaning up violence. Marco approached Antonio, his expression grim but unsurprised. "I told you she was making you soft," Marco said. "She's making me human," Antonio corrected, his eyes never leaving Stephanie. "There's a difference." Inside, Nona made espresso like nothing unusual had happened, while Stephanie cleaned the blood from Antonio's knuckles with gentle efficiency. Her hands shook slightly, the only sign that she wasn't as calm as she pretended to be. "You're scared," Antonio said quietly. "Terrified," Stephanie admitted. "But not of you. For you." "Antonio, what if they'd had guns? What if there'd been more of them? What if—" "But there weren't," he interrupted, catching her hand. "Stephanie, you need to understand what you're getting into. This is my world. Violence, danger, threats. This won't be the last time." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears but also something fierce and unyielding. "Then we deal with it. Together. Because I'm not walking away from you, Antonio Russo. Not because you're dangerous. Not because your world is complicated, not because you just beat up 4 men on my lawn." She took a shaky breath. "I'm in this. All the way in." "Are you?" Antonio stared at her. This impossible woman who'd crashed into his lonely life and refused to be scared away. He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. "All the way in," he confirmed. "Even when I shouldn't be. Especially then." Stephanie whispered against his chest. Outside, Marco supervised the cleanup. Inside, Nona poured espresso and muttered in Italian about men who bring trouble to decent neighborhoods but at least have the courtesy to defend them properly. And Antonio, for the first time in his life, felt truly seen, not just the power or the danger, but all of him, and still chosen. It was terrifying. It was perfect, and there was no going back. The penthouse had never felt so suffocating. Antonio stood by the windows, his usual refuge, watching the city lights blur into a mosaic of gold and white. Behind him, Stephanie paced the length of his living room with the restless energy of someone who'd been holding back questions for too long. They'd left Queens an hour ago, after Marco assured them the scene was handled and the house was secure. Nona had sent them off with a container of biscotti and a pointed instruction to talk like adults, not children playing dangerous games. So here they were, not talking. Just the sound of Stephanie's footsteps on marble and the distant hum of the city below. "Are we just going to stand here in silence?" Stephanie finally asked, her voice tight. "Because that's your thing, not mine. I need words, Antonio. I need you to explain what just happened." Antonio didn't turn around. "What do you want me to say?" "You saw what I am, what I'm capable of." "I saw you protect my family," Stephanie countered, stopping her pacing. "But that's not what's eating at you, is it? You're not worried about what I saw. You're worried about what I'll figure out." "Stephanie." "No." Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "You don't get to shut down on me now, not after everything. Not after you kissed me like I was the only real thing in your life. Then turned around and nearly killed 4 men on my lawn." She walked closer, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. "Why did you drag me into this darkness, Antonio? Because, if this is your world, if this is what being close to you means, I deserve to know why you let it happen. You're not stupid. You knew this would put me in danger." Antonio finally turned, and the devastation in his eyes made Stephanie's breath catch. "I was selfish," he said quietly. "I saw something bright and warm and real, and I took it without thinking about the consequences, without thinking about what my world would do to you." "That's not an answer," Stephanie pressed. "That's an excuse. You've spent your entire life calculating risks and managing threats. You don't do anything without thinking it through, so tell me the truth. Why me? Why risk everything for a maid who left sticky notes on your contracts and dragged you to Queens for Christmas dinner?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Antonio looked at her, really looked at her, this fearless woman who refused to let him hide behind walls and careful words. She deserved the truth, even if it destroyed what they had. "Because I'm terrified of being alone forever," he said, his voice raw. "And you made me believe I didn't have to be." Stephanie's expression softened, but she didn't back down. "Then tell me why you were alone in the first place. Tell me why a man who could have anything, anyone, chose to spend 10 years in this empty palace pretending isolation was strength." Antonio turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him like an accusation. "My father was a violent man," he began, the words coming slowly, painfully. "Not in business he was brilliant, calculating, controlled. But at home, with my mother," he stopped, his jaw clenching. "He loved her. In his own twisted way, he loved her more than anything, and that love destroyed her." Stephanie moved closer but didn't touch him, sensing he needed space to finish. "What happened? I was 12. My father had enemies, rivals who thought they could get to him through us. They sent threats, tried intimidation. My father became paranoid, controlling. He wouldn't let my mother leave the house, wouldn't let her have friends. He said he was protecting her." Antonio's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "One night, she tried to leave, just to visit her sister. My father thought she was abandoning him, that the threats had gotten to her, that she was running." He paused. "They fought. It was an accident," he said later. "A push at the top of the stairs. But she was dead either way." "Antonio," Stephanie breathed, her hand instinctively reaching for him. He stepped away, not ready for comfort. "My father unraveled after that. The business, his empire, everything he'd built, it all fell apart because he couldn't function without her. And I watched it happen. I watched him destroy himself because he'd loved someone so much that losing her meant losing everything." Antonio finally looked at her, his eyes dark with old pain. "I swore I'd never be that weak, never give anyone that kind of power over me. Love wasn't strength, it was a fatal vulnerability." "So you built walls," Stephanie said softly. "You made yourself untouchable." "I made myself safe," Antonio corrected. "Alone, but safe. And it worked. For years, it worked." Until you walked into my life humming pop songs and leaving ridiculous coffee mugs on my desk, and suddenly being alone felt like the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. Stephanie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. So what changed? Why let me in? Because I was tired, Antonio said simply. Tired of the silence. Tired of the emptiness. Tired of pretending that power and control were enough to fill the void. He moved closer to her now, his expression raw and unguarded. And because you didn't look at me like I was a monster or a prize. You looked at me like I was human. Like I was worth saving. You are worth saving, Stephanie said fiercely. No, I'm not. Antonio's voice turned harsh. Stephanie, you need to understand what tonight meant. The Corsini family knows about you now. They know you matter to me. That makes you a target for every enemy I have, every rival who wants to hurt me, every person with a grudge and enough desperation to act on it. He took a breath. What you saw tonight? That will happen again. And next time, I might not be there. Next time, you could be the one lying broken on that lawn. So what are you saying? Stephanie asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. Antonio reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. This contains everything you need. New identity. Bank accounts in your name with enough money to live comfortably anywhere in the world. Contacts for security personnel who will keep you safe. Untraceable. He held it out to her, his hand steady even as something in his expression shattered. Walk away, Stephanie. Right now before it's too late. I'll make sure you're protected. I'll make sure the Corsinis and anyone else knows you're off limits. But you have to leave. You have to be smart enough to walk away from this. Stephanie stared at the flash drive like it was a poisonous snake. You're asking me to leave you. I'm begging you to save yourself, Antonio corrected, his voice breaking. Because I can't lose you the way my father lost my mother. I can't become that. And I can't watch this world destroy the only good thing I've had in 10 years. So your solution is to destroy it yourself. Stephanie's voice rose with anger. To push me away before anyone else can hurt me? That's not protection, Antonio. That's cowardice. It's survival, he shot back. For both of us. No. Stephanie knocked the flash drive out of his hand, sending it skittering across the marble floor. No. You don't get to make this decision for me. You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take, or what I'm capable of handling. Stephanie, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, stepping closer until she was right in his space, forcing him to see her, to hear her. I understand that you're terrified. I understand that you watched your father destroy himself with love and decided that meant love itself was the enemy. But you're wrong, Antonio. Love didn't destroy your father. Fear did. Control did. The belief that he could protect your mother by caging her. Antonio shook his head. You can't. I'm not your mother, Stephanie said firmly. And you're not your father. What happened to them was a tragedy. But it doesn't have to be your story. It doesn't have to define every relationship you have for the rest of your life. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Stephanie cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You're afraid of being the lonely man who loses everything. But Antonio, you're more afraid of being the man who pushes everything away before he can lose it. And that's worse than any threat the Corsini family could make. Antonio's careful control cracked. I can't lose you, he whispered. I survived alone for 10 years. But I won't survive losing you. So please, Stephanie, please be smarter than I am. Please walk away. Stephanie felt tears slip down her cheeks, but her voice was steady. I'm not afraid of the Mafia boss. Antonio. I'm not even afraid of the violence or the danger or whatever the Corsinis want to throw at us. She pulled him closer. I'm afraid of the lonely man who thinks he doesn't deserve to be loved. I'm afraid of you spending another 10 years in this empty penthouse, convincing yourself that isolation equals strength. That terrifies me more than anything your world can do. Stephanie, you want to know why I'm not leaving? She interrupted. Because you're not poison to me, Antonio. You're the countervenom. You're the cure to every safe, predictable, small life I thought I was supposed to want. Yes, you're dangerous. Yes, your world is brutal and complicated, and probably going to give me gray hair before I'm 30. But you're also the first person who ever made me feel like I was more than just background noise in someone else's story. Antonio stared at her, something raw and desperate in his expression. I'm asking you one more time. Walk away, please. No. Stephanie pulled him down and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tentative. It was a claiming, an answer to every question he'd asked, every doubt he'd voiced. She kissed him like she was trying to pour every ounce of certainty she had into him, trying to make him understand that she was choosing this, choosing him, choosing the danger and the darkness because she also saw the light. Antonio resisted for maybe 3 seconds before he shattered completely. His arms came around her, pulling her close with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness, years of careful control finally breaking. He kissed her back with everything he'd been holding in the fear, the hope, the need he'd tried so hard to deny. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Antonio pressed his forehead to hers. "This is insane," he whispered. "You're insane for staying." "Then we're both insane," Stephanie replied. "But at least we're insane together." Antonio pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "If you stay, everything changes. I can't protect you from everything. I can't promise you'll always be safe." "I don't want safe," Stephanie said. "I want real. I want you, all of you, the good, the dangerous, the lonely, the brilliant. I want the man who showed up at my Nona's house because he couldn't stand another silent Christmas. That's who I'm choosing." For a long moment, Antonio just held her, letting the truth of her choice sink in. She wasn't leaving. She'd seen the worst of his world and she wasn't leaving. The relief of it, the terrifying joy, was almost too much to bear. "I love you," he said quietly. The words foreign but true. "I don't know when it happened, but I love you, and that terrifies me." Stephanie smiled through her tears. "Good. Love should be a little terrifying. It means it matters." She kissed him softly. "I love you too. You impossible, overprotective, reformed, Christmas-hating disaster of a man." Antonio laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "What do we do now?" "Now?" Stephanie pulled back and picked up the flash drive from where it had fallen, handing it back to him. "Now you put this away, we eat the biscotti Nona sent, and tomorrow we figure out how to make the Corsinis regret ever threatening us." She grinned. "Together. Together," Antonio repeated, and for the first time since he was 12 years old, the word didn't sound like a weakness. It sounded like a promise. The war room in Antonio's penthouse had been transformed into something that looked more like a detective's conspiracy board than a legitimate business space. Documents covered every surface, laptops displayed financial records and shipping manifests, and a massive whiteboard bore Stephanie's surprisingly neat handwriting outlining the Corsini family's business structure. Marco stood by the window, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Antonio sat at the head of the table, reviewing contracts with the focused intensity that had made him legendary. And Stephanie, perched on the edge of the desk with her shoes kicked off and a red pen in her mouth, studied a document with the concentration of someone solving a particularly difficult puzzle. "This doesn't make sense," she said for the third time in 10 minutes. Marco sighed. "Miss Banks, our financial team has reviewed those shipping records 6 times. There's nothing there." "But there is," Stephanie insisted, pulling the pen from her mouth and pointing at a line of numbers. "Look at this. The Corsini's import company shows regular shipments from Naples, right? But the tonnage doesn't match the cargo description." "Could be a clerical error," Marco suggested, though his tone was less dismissive than it had been a week ago. "Or it could be intentional misdirection," Antonio said, leaning forward with interest. "Stephanie, what are you thinking?" She grabbed 3 different documents, laying them side by side. "Your team was looking for illegal activity, drugs, weapons, the obvious stuff. But what if they're not smuggling contraband? What if they're smuggling legitimate goods without paying import taxes?" She tapped the numbers. "These shipments are listed as textiles, but the weight suggests something much heavier. And look at the frequency every 2 weeks, like clockwork, always through the same customs inspector. Marco moved closer to the table, his expression shifting from skeptical to intrigued. If they're underreporting cargo weight and value, they're committing massive tax fraud, Antonio finished, a slow smile spreading across his face. Which means this isn't just a matter for the streets. This is federal. Exactly, Stephanie said, warming to her subject. The Corsinis have been so careful about keeping their organized crime activities clean. But tax evasion? That's how they got Al Capone. And if you anonymously provide this information to the right people at the IRS, she spread her hands. The government does your dirty work for you. Marco stared at her for a long moment, then looked at Antonio. She's good. I know, Antonio replied, his eyes on Stephanie with something that looked a lot like pride mixed with love. She's brilliant. Stephanie blushed. I just spent a lot of time watching crime documentaries with Nona. She's obsessed with forensic accounting shows. Your grandmother watches forensic accounting shows? Marco asked, incredulous. She finds them soothing, Stephanie defended. The point is, we can take down the Corsinis without firing a single shot. We just need to compile this evidence and make sure it lands on the right desk. Antonio stood, walking around the table to where Stephanie sat. He cupped her face and kissed her soundly, ignoring Marco's exaggerated throat clearing. You just ended a war with paperwork and basic math. You're extraordinary. I'm really not, Stephanie protested, but she was smiling. I just look at things differently than your scary financial team. Which is exactly why I need you, Antonio said. Then, to Marco, make it happen. Anonymous tip to the federal prosecutor's office, complete documentation. The works. I want the Corsinis buried in legal problems by the end of January. Marco nodded, gathering documents. Consider it done, boss. He paused at the door, looking back at Stephanie. Good work, Miss Banks. Even if you do leave sticky notes that give me heart palpitations. After he left, Stephanie laughed. I think Marco might actually be warming up to me. He'd better, Antonio said. Because you're not going anywhere. He pulled her closer, his expression turning serious. Stephanie, there's something I want to ask you. If it's about New Year's Eve. I already told you I'd come to your gala thing, Stephanie said. Even though the idea of wearing a fancy dress and making small talk with people who could buy my entire neighborhood terrifies me. It's not about the gala, Antonio said, then reconsidered. Well, it is. But not the way you think. He took a breath, looking almost nervous, an expression Stephanie had never seen on him. Just, trust me? Always, Stephanie said simply. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of excessive elegance that made Stephanie want to hide in a closet. Antonio's penthouse had been transformed into something from a magazine spread: crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, champagne towers, and enough flowers to supply a small wedding. The guest list read like a who's who of New York's power players, business moguls, politicians, and yes, several people Stephanie suspected were on the more interesting side of legal enterprise. She stood near the windows in a midnight blue dress that Antonio had insisted on buying, silk that draped perfectly and probably cost more than 3 months of her old salary. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist, courtesy of a stylist who'd arrived at the penthouse that afternoon. She looked sophisticated, polished, completely unlike herself. "Stop fidgeting," Antonio murmured, appearing at her elbow with 2 champagne flutes. "You look stunning." "I look like I'm playing dress-up," Stephanie countered, accepting the champagne. "Everyone here probably knows I used to clean these floors. Everyone here knows you're brilliant enough to solve a problem my entire financial team couldn't crack," Antonio corrected. "And that you're with me, which makes you untouchable." "Romantic," Stephanie said dryly. But she was smiling. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and polite conversations. Stephanie navigated it with surprising grace, her natural warmth disarming people who'd arrived expecting to judge Antonio's unexpected choice of companion. She charmed a state senator with stories about her Nona, made a real estate developer laugh with her honest assessment of the catering. "It's beautiful, but Have you tried actually eating it? I think that appetizer is mostly garnish, and generally proved that authenticity could hold its own against carefully cultivated sophistication. Then she tripped over absolutely nothing and nearly face-planted into a champagne tower. Antonio caught her with reflexes that suggested he'd been expecting something like this. "Steady," he murmured, fighting a smile. "These shoes are death traps," Stephanie hissed. "Why do people wear heels? What's wrong with sensible footwear?" "I love you," Antonio said suddenly, loudly enough that several nearby conversations stopped. Stephanie blinked. "You say that every time I almost destroy expensive things." "Because it's true." Antonio set down both their glasses and, to Stephanie's shock, tapped a fork against a crystal glass. The sharp chime cut through the room, conversations dying as everyone turned to look. "Ladies and gentlemen," Antonio began, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent space. "Thank you for being here tonight." "Antonio, what are you doing?" Stephanie whispered urgently. He squeezed her hand, a silent request for trust, and continued. "Most of you know me as a businessman, a strategist, someone who values control and calculated decisions above all else." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "What you might not know is that for the past decade, I've spent every Christmas alone, every New Year's alone. Every moment that should have been about connection and joy, I spent in isolation, convincing myself that solitude equaled strength." The room was utterly silent now. Marco, standing near the bar, had gone very still, his expression unreadable. Several guests exchanged glances, clearly uncertain where this was going. Antonio turned to Stephanie, his expression softening in a way that made her breath catch. "Then this woman walked into my life. She was supposed to be just another staff member, someone I'd barely notice. Instead, she noticed me. She saw past the reputation and the walls and the carefully maintained distance, and she did something no one else had dared to do in years." "Antonio," Stephanie said quietly, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "She invited me to her grandmother's house for Christmas dinner," Antonio continued, a smile tugging at his lips. "She challenged me when I was wrong. She made me laugh when I'd forgotten how. She solved problems my experts couldn't, and she stayed. Even when staying meant danger and violence and everything her world wasn't supposed to include." He reached into his pocket, and Stephanie's heart stopped as he pulled out a small velvet box. Around them she heard several gasps, the soft exclamations of people realizing what was happening. "Stephanie Banks," Antonio said, opening the box to reveal a ring that was somehow both elegant and unpretentious, a single diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like stars. "I spent every Christmas alone because I thought silence was strength. You taught me that the only true strength is having the courage to love. You are the chaos that saves me, the truth I'd forgotten I needed, the home I didn't know I was looking for." Tears were streaming down Stephanie's face now, and she didn't even care that several dozen powerful people were watching. "You're proposing," she said, her voice breaking. "In front of everyone." "I'm claiming you," Antonio corrected gently. "In front of everyone who matters. So they know. So there's no question. So the entire world understands that you're not just mine, I'm yours. Completely, irrevocably, forever." He took a breath. "Marry me, Stephanie. I need the noise, I need the mess, I need you to keep asking me questions no one else dares to ask. I need you to keep leaving sticky notes on my contracts and tripping over your own feet and making me remember what it means to be human." Stephanie laughed through her tears, the sound bright and joyful in the silent room. "That's the longest speech I've ever heard you give." "Is that a yes?" Antonio asked, and for the first time all evening he looked nervous. "You just proposed to me in front of half of New York's criminal underworld," Stephanie said, wiping her eyes. "If I said no, we'd both look ridiculous." "Stephanie," Antonio warned, though his lips twitched. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, of course, yes. You impossible, overprotective, secretly romantic disaster of a man. Yes." Antonio slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, because of course he'd somehow figured out her size, and kissed her with an enthusiasm that suggested he'd forgotten they had an audience. The room erupted in applause, a few appreciative whistles mixing with the clapping. When they finally broke apart, Stephanie whispered against his lips, "You know my Nona is going to have opinions about the wedding planning." "I'm counting on it," Antonio replied. "I want the noise, remember? I want the chaos. I want every bit of your world mixed with mine. Even the inflatable snowman? Especially the inflatable snowman." Across the room, Marco caught Antonio's eye and gave a single, subtle nod, respect and acceptance, and maybe, just maybe, approval. Several guests approached to offer congratulations, their carefully neutral expressions transforming into genuine warmth as they witnessed Stephanie's unguarded joy. As midnight approached and the countdown began, Antonio pulled Stephanie close, both of them surrounded by people but aware only of each other. 10, 9, 8. "Are you sure about this?" Stephanie asked quietly. "Once we're engaged, everyone knows. Everyone will be watching." 7, 6, 5. "Let them watch," Antonio said. "Let them see that the monster they feared found something worth being human for." 4, 3, 2. "I love you," Stephanie said. 1. "I love you," Antonio replied, and kissed her as the room exploded in celebration, as champagne corks popped and confetti fell, and the new year began. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Antonio Russo welcomed the chaos with open arms. 6 months after the engagement, Stephanie officially moved into the penthouse. She arrived with 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of books, a collection of truly terrible coffee mugs, and a potted plant she'd named Gerald that was somehow still alive despite her best efforts to kill it through neglect. "This is everything?" Antonio asked. Looking at her modest pile of belongings in the middle of his expansive living room. "I'm a minimalist," Stephanie said cheerfully, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm just broke, but we can call it minimalism if it sounds better." Antonio pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You're not broke anymore. You're engaged to a man with more money than sense. Your romantic declarations need work," Stephanie teased. But she was smiling. The penthouse transformed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Gerald the plant found a home by the window. Stephanie's colorful coffee mugs invaded the pristine kitchen cabinets. Throw pillows appeared on the minimalist couch, not expensive designer pillows, but cheerful, mismatched ones Stephanie found at a home goods store because they looked happy. Family photos materialized on surfaces that had previously held only expensive sculptures. Nona at her kitchen table, Uncle Carlo mid-laugh, the whole family squeezed together at last Christmas. Antonio's carefully curated silence gave way to sound. Stephanie hummed while she worked, played music that Antonio would never have chosen but found himself enjoying, and had a habit of narrating her thoughts out loud in a way that should have been annoying but was actually endearing. "Why are all your towels white?" she'd asked one morning, standing in the bathroom doorway. "It's like living in a very expensive hospital. We're getting colored towels. Blue ones, maybe some with little ducks on them." "Ducks," Antonio had repeated flatly. "Ducks are cheerful," Stephanie defended. "You could use more cheerful in your life." "They got the duck towels." Antonio pretended to hate them. Stephanie knew he secretly found them amusing because she caught him smiling at them when he thought she wasn't looking. Nona's guest suite was completed in early fall. Antonio had insisted on sparing no expense, a full bedroom with an ensuite bathroom, a small sitting area, and a kitchenette, because, "Your grandmother will want to cook, and I'm not having her commandeer my kitchen at 3 in the morning. She cooks at 3 a.m. once," Stephanie had protested. "One time. And it was for a very good reason." "What reason?" "She couldn't sleep and stress bakes." "It's a family trait." The suite was beautiful, comfortable, and decorated with enough warmth to feel like home while maintaining the elegance of the penthouse. Nona visited for a weekend, inspected every corner with the critical eye of someone who'd raised 5 children in a 2-bedroom house, and pronounced it acceptable, but you need more pictures of family on the walls. By the next day, there were more pictures. Antonio adapted to his new reality with the same focused determination he brought to everything else. He learned to leave work, at work sometimes, to laugh at Stephanie's ridiculous jokes even when they weren't funny, to accept that his perfectly organized life now included things like sticky notes, reminding him to smile more. You're scaring the interns, and surprise visits from Stephanie's cousins, who treated his penthouse like their personal hangout spot. He still struggled with perfection. One morning, Stephanie found him rearranging the throw pillows she'd artfully, her word, thrown, accurate, on the couch. "What are you doing?" she asked, coffee in hand. "They were uneven," Antonio said, looking slightly embarrassed at being caught. "They're throw pillows, Antonio. The word throw is literally in the name. They're supposed to look casual. They look chaotic." "Good," Stephanie said, walking over and deliberately messing up his careful arrangement. "Chaos is our brand now. Embrace it." Antonio stared at the pillows, then at her, then back at the pillows. "This is going to drive me crazy." "I know," Stephanie said, kissing his cheek. "But you love me anyway." "Unfortunately," Antonio replied, but he was smiling, and he didn't fix the pillows again. 1 year and 3 days after that first Christmas invitation, Antonio and Stephanie drove back to Queens on Christmas Eve. The Maserati had been replaced with something more practical, a luxury SUV that could handle New York winters and had enough room for the ridiculous amount of presents Stephanie had insisted on buying for her family. Antonio wore his usual expensive coat and tailored suit, but around his neck was a monstrosity of a scarf, bright red with embroidered snowmen, and the words, "Let it snow," in glittering silver thread. Stephanie had given it to him that morning with a challenge in her eyes, daring him to refuse. He'd put it on without a word. "You know you look ridiculous, right?" Stephanie said, glancing at him from the passenger seat. "I'm aware," Antonio replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "But you're wearing it anyway." "You gave it to me," Antonio said simply, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the city giving way to familiar streets, the landscape transforming into the neighborhood that had become as much Antonio's home as his penthouse. Christmas lights blinked from houses, inflatable decorations swayed in the winter wind, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. "Thank you," Antonio said quietly. Stephanie looked at him. "For what? The scarf?" "Because that was pure self-interest. You look adorable." "For the invitation," Antonio said, his voice soft. "A year ago, for seeing me standing alone in that penthouse and refusing to leave me there." Stephanie's expression softened. "Antonio, I spent 10 years alone," he continued, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. 10 years convincing myself that isolation was strength, that control meant safety, that needing people was weakness. And the only thing I regret, the only thing I would change if I could, is that I wasted so much time, that I let fear keep me locked away when I could have been living. "You're living now," Stephanie said gently, reaching over to take his hand. "Because of you," Antonio replied. "Because you walked into my life with your terrible coffee mugs and your sticky notes and your absolute refusal to be intimidated by me. You saved me, Stephanie. From myself, from my past, from a future that would have been nothing but silence and expensive things and profound emptiness." Stephanie felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved me too, you know. I was living the smallest version of my life, playing it safe, afraid to want more than I thought I deserved. You made me brave." Antonio lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "We saved each other then." "Better story," Stephanie agreed. They turned onto Maplewood Avenue, and there it was, the small yellow house with the crooked wreath, now joined by approximately 17,000 additional Christmas lights that Uncle Carlo had insisted on installing. The inflatable snowman had been retired in favor of an inflatable Santa that was somehow even more ridiculous. Antonio parked the car, but neither of them moved immediately. They sat there, watching the warm glow from the windows, hearing the faint sound of music and laughter from inside. "You know what the best part is?" Stephanie asked. "What?" A year ago you showed up here terrified and alone, convinced you didn't belong. Now look at you wearing a ridiculous scarf, about to walk into chaos like it's the most natural thing in the world." Antonio looked down at the offensive scarf, then at the house, then at Stephanie. "I belong here because you're here. That's the only reason any of this works." "Sweet," Stephanie said, unbuckling her seatbelt, "but also partially accurate. You belong here because you let yourself belong here, because you stopped being afraid of needing people." They got out of the car, gathering presents from the back. As they walked up the familiar pathway, Antonio stopped suddenly, causing Stephanie to nearly bump into him. "What's wrong?" she asked. Antonio set down the presents and turned to face her fully. The porch light cast warm shadows across his face, and in the distance, they could hear the opening bars of a Dean Martin Christmas song, the same one that had been playing a year ago. "Marry me," Antonio said. Stephanie blinked. Antonio, we're already engaged. You proposed in front of half of New York, remember? Big romantic speech? Ring?" "I said yes." "I know," Antonio said, pulling her close. "But last time I proposed because I wanted the world to know you were mine. This time, I'm proposing because I want you to know something else." He cupped her face in his hands. "I want to marry you, Stephanie Banks. Not in some elaborate ceremony with people I barely know. I want to marry you here, at Nona's, surrounded by the family and chaos that taught me what home really means. I want every Christmas for the rest of my life to be here, with you, with them, with the noise and the mess, and the absolutely terrible decorations." Stephanie was crying now, not even trying to hide it. "You want to get married at Nona's? I want to promise you forever in the place where my forever began," Antonio said. "Only if we spend every Christmas at Nona's, only if we keep the ridiculous scarf tradition, only if you promise to keep leaving sticky notes and challenging me and refusing to let me retreat into silence when things get hard." "I can do that," Stephanie said, laughing through her tears. "I'm actually excellent at all of those things." "I need the noise," Antonio continued, echoing his words from a year ago, from the proposal, from every moment he'd tried to express what she meant to him. "I need the mess. I need you to keep asking me the questions no one else dares to ask. I need you to keep being the chaos that saves me." "Then you've got me," Stephanie said, pulling him down for a kiss. "Forever. Through every Christmas, every ridiculous scarf, every family dinner, every moment of beautiful, perfect chaos." They kissed there on the pathway. Snow beginning to fall around them, the sounds of celebration spilling from the yellow house behind them. When they finally broke apart, Antonio rested his forehead against hers. "Home isn't the fortress," he whispered. "No," Stephanie agreed. "Home is wherever we are together." The door burst open, and Nona appeared, wrapped in her trademark apron and wielding a wooden spoon like a weapon. "Are you two going to stand out there all night like lovesick teenagers, or are you coming inside? The food is getting cold, and I didn't cook for 6 hours so you could kiss on my lawn." "We're coming, Nona," Stephanie called, but she didn't immediately move. Antonio picked up the presents, but before they walked inside, he looked back at the penthouse's general direction, that fortress he'd built, that beautiful prison he'd escaped from. Then he looked at the warm, chaotic, perfect house in front of him, and he smiled. "Ready?" Stephanie asked, holding out her hand. Antonio took it, his ridiculous scarf bright against the winter night, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. "Ready." They walked through the door together, into the noise and the laughter and the overwhelming warmth of family. Uncle Carlo immediately pulled Antonio into a debate about cars. Gina and Maria descended on Stephanie, demanding to see the wedding planning progress. Nona pressed a glass of wine into Antonio's hand and informed him he looked too thin, and she was personally offended by his weight loss. And Antonio Russo, the man who'd spent a decade alone, who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be human, stood in the middle of beautiful chaos and realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not silence. Not control, not the safety of isolation, but home. And as Stephanie caught his eye across the room and smiled that same fearless, warmth-filled smile that had started everything, Antonio smiled back. Because this was where he belonged. Not in spite of the noise and mess and chaos, but because of it. Forever. What did you think of Stephanie and Antonio's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss any of our stories. And check out more stories on Bella's romance stories.